Hello, I'm Corazón Alvina, Director of the Museo ng Kaalamang Katutubo. In today's episode of Cultural Cash Online, I will talk about a work by national artist Jerry Elizalde Navarro that is in the Cultural Center of the Philippines Visual Arts Collection. The artwork is titled Constellation. In 1995, I curated a retrospective of Jerry Elizalde Navarro at the Metropolitan Museum of Manila. It's my pleasure to talk about this specific artwork and also to share my fond reminiscences of Mr. Navarro. When I curated the retrospective, my plan was to present as many of the best creations in all the art forms that he engaged in. A comment from a viewer during the retrospective remarked that he thought the exhibit was that of a number of artists instead of one. J. Elizalde Navarro did not believe in styles or a signature color image. His intellectual creativity and skill and expertise in handling matter and material allowed him to essay whatever moved him in whatever medium he chose. He also had the daring to be independent, to think apart from market demands and trends. But one thing was constant. Whatever medium he expressed himself in, he did with utter commitment and impeccably. His drawings were scrupulously realized. Perfect human anatomy, fluidity in the apostles' robes, unerring light and shadow in 14 stations of the cross. The same flawless drafting was applied to a cordial portrayal of a sleeping cat. I think I remember two national artists, Mr. Navarro and Mr. Arturo Luz, telling me that everything starts with drawing. One must draw well or learn how to do so before one can venture into the art forms. Both were peerless graphic designers with a mastery of typography and the brilliance for configuring space for large exhibitions such as pavilions for world fairs. The specimens of Navarro's graphic design show soundness of thinking and logic translated into layout and visual impressions. To say that Navarro's watercolors on paper are charming is an injustice. I had both a curator's dream and nightmare in the paintings, overwhelming in number, each one compelling as the next. Selecting and editing was complicated and demanding, given the wealth of material so generously at hand. But the curating was a delightful experience. The artist was not at all difficult, agreed to most if not all suggestions proffered, such as hanging the paintings higher than the usual 60 inches eye level and installing paintings that limned kites in flight, not on the usual walls, but on the higher space, the skirt between the first and second levels of the Met, across from where his Icarus sculpture hovered. And as the last element to be put in place, the title panel. He agreed to sign it, so that by the time of dismantling, the crew did not know what to do with the panel, as they did not want to disrespect him. Paintings produced after the artist's trip to Japan were charming, precise and subtle at the same time in mood. Shall we say Japanese in disposition? On the other hand, the color and motion explosion of the images of dancers and festivals after his residency, in a manner of speaking, in Bali was exhilarating. Yet his strokes and the registers of hand-picked colors were unambiguous in their vigor and rigorous. Some of the Met staff were anxious about the many nudes, a favorite subject of the artist. The CCP also holds one of Navarro's paintings, which could be described as a combination of his Ben-Day dots-inspired days in Australia and in his unabashed celebration of the vividness of Bali, and a homage to his dear friend, national artist Carlos Francisco, Center in the painting are the initials CVF. During quiet moments, during the curatorial work and the making of a book published by the Met Museum, Navarro would recall how in their younger days, Botong and he would dream and plan going to Bali. With sadness in his voice, Navarro would say he made it. But sadly, Botong did not. I would see Constellation as frequently as I went to the CCP when I ventured to where it was positioned. It always delighted me that each time I looked at it, depending on where I stood or cast the eye, it presented variations of a geometric structure. Of course, it was included in the curatorial lineup for sculpture. The conservator and the art handlers of the Met were amused, if a bit frightened, when they went across Ross Boulevard to collect the artwork. They said that when it was loaded into the elevator, the lift went down a few centimeters because of the weight. And none of the vehicles available to the Met could handle the poundage. So they loaded it on a pallet truck and pushed across the boulevard. Quite a sight for pedestrians and motorists. Navarro was among the first artists in the Philippines who created using materials perceived to be unconventional for art, such as rods of steel blowtorched into a composition that takes a while to be coherent in one's mind. Constellation is a study in the dynamism of a structure that would expectedly be assumed to be static. Lines and outlines, silhouettes and patterns, intersections. There is balance and a logic to the directionality of the connections of the steel rods, so that movement is perceived and a mood is elicited. And yes, connection seems to be an overall concept in it. Connections that grow out of and into one another. Integrity is gleaned from material and arrangement of elements. What is a constellation? And how did it enter Mr. Navarro's mind to reproduce or mimic one in a scale that is infinitesimal to a vast celestial gathering of stars we know as a constellation? Was it because the stars suggest a representation, an outline of something real? Or because bodies that moved in the skies have ever excited the human imagination? Probably both. Mr. Navarro had a grasp of reality in various registers, which he articulated figuratively, though many times he expressed the real world and its corporeality in his vocabulary of abstraction. But he also had the liveliest imagination, kept an open door for fantasy, cobbled found objects for compelling perceptorial engagements, inventing and originating stories to set on canvas or contrive with struts and shafts. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Cultural Cash Online.